Thank you so much. And thank you to my siblings and uncles and aunties and brothers and sisters and everyone here. And it's always wonderful to return again and again to not just our conspiracy, but to this country that hosts this beautiful conspiracy. As I was telling Sarah and some of my siblings in the VIP room behind the scenes, that I am on my way to Minneapolis in a couple of hours, and I would have to drive to Connecticut to catch my flight around 3 a.m. The flight is around 5 a.m., but I would have to drive there earlier, of course. Um, so I just thought that I would share uh, a few activating thoughts, um, some some things that I'm pondering in these moments. And if I were to put it under a headline, I would probably call it the crisis of pedagogy. Um, and it's not a crisis in pedagogy, but the crisis of pedagogy. Um, and I'll say what I mean by that. It's something I started to notice as I started to host these wonderful global planetary courses that I call We Will Dance with Mountains, that it seemed we were coming slowly to the edges of its usefulness, right? Um, that pedagogy needed something else. It had come to the fullness of itself, instruction. Of course, by pedagogy, I mean um, etymologically speaking, it's the teaching of children, but it's used to speak about learning and teaching in general, of course. Um, my sense is that we are in such political moments at the heart of pedagogy can no longer hold the ontological weight of these political moments that we're in. One presupposition is that learners precede learning, that we are the ones doing the learning, right? That learning is more or less domiciled and hosted by the neural complexity of our brains, the cortices, prefrontal cortex, that we learn here. And that true learning leads to a change in behavior. And the way we learn is to present information, bring data, bring information, and then people change, right? Um, that's pedagogy. There are other types of gogis, right? In the goji family, there's there's andragogy. Andragogy is the teaching of adults. Heutagogy, Heuta goji, is self-directed education. Now, if you notice in all of these notions of learning, something is stabilized. Something stabilized, whether it's pedagogy or heutagogy or andragogy, it's something is fixed in place. And that's the self that learns, right? The self that learns is is fixed. Everything else can be variable, but or can vary, but the self that learns is never varying. We always start with the individual that learns about the world. What style that individual takes to learn about the world can vary, but the individual is the house, the host of learning. Um, and why do I say then that pedagogy is in crisis? There is a crisis of pedagogy now. It's because we've been trying to teach and change behavior for decades with regards to many things, a myriad number of things, but we're not quite successful. Since the 70s, we've been trying to change climate-related behavior. We've been trying to get people to, you know, recycle more or do stuff, be more ecologically minded. But it doesn't seem to be yielding the kinds of results as would lend itself to transformation, right? Now, I'm going to bring it home specifically to the political moments in the United States. And I say this hoping that uh, Kurt isn't working for ICE. Uh, hoping you're not ICE, Kurt. I know you aren't. It's good to see you, brother. A lot of people are sensing the I'm recalling the the conversations I've been having that the United States is in. Um, Everyone seems to be asking the question. This happened to me recently. I was buying jollof rice at a West African store in Jamaica, New York. This is about a week ago, almost a week ago. I was buying Nigerian jollof rice. And the person who was selling this to me asked me a question. He said, why would anyone look at this man being our dear leader? Why would anyone look at this man and vote for him the second time? Right. And that question was more theoretically significant than is more theoretically significant than we would, you know, care to notice. He was not just asking why anyone would do it. He was asking what are the patterns, the principalities that keep things repeating themselves over and over again. He was asking about the failures of pedagogy because the political moments I'm sensing in the United States are based upon this myth that if only we can fact check the other side properly, then they would see, then it would be obvious that they've been misled. If only we can present the truth to the others, then they would know that, they've been taken for a ride. If only we can stand up, as we are doing, as we're resisting. If only we can resist by using all the tools in our boxes to tell the truth and to show the world that this is a lie. Maybe facts matter. Maybe we can push back against the um, uh, what do they call it? Fake news-ish world we've entered in, the bizarre absurdities of politics now in the United States. Maybe we can push back on that a little. Um, but it seems like the very attempt to fact check only reinforces an understanding, at least in conservative, or you might call it the MAGA side of the United States, that everyone on the other side is wrong. It seems we're in such a scenario where the obvious, and I would argue that the obvious has never been apolitical. The obvious is heavily political. The obvious isn't obvious any longer. Those tools, fact checking, they matter, but we're in such a terrain that it seems other pieces are at work. It's not about the individual that learns. It's about larger algorithms, more than systemic algorithms that are taking these bodies and fashioning subjectivity, fashioning the psyche so that it tends to the world in particular ways. I'm speaking about ecologies of knowing, right? I'm suggesting that knowing has never been anchored to a stable human subject. That we know with. Knowing is relational work. Knowing is sprawl. Knowing is ecological, right? I was just sharing with others today how I was here in this same house last year when there was an attempt on the life of then candidate Trump. And only a few minutes later, after the fact, everyone seemed to know exactly what had happened, depending on the tribe you were in. There were two accounts of what happened. On one side, it was evidently clear that it was a conspiracy. It wasn't real. It was just a conspiracy. And on the other side, without any investigation done, on the other side, it was just as clear that there was that this was the hand of God. This was God selecting with his own hand the next president of the United States. And my question was, how do we come to know these things, right? You could talk about the social algorithms, the digital spheres at work that are ignited with every claim to knowledge, right? We're in such times that when we use the internet feeds us into tribes, right? If you investigate in a particular way, it notices your direction and it says, here's more for you to feed on. It's a feedback loop that reinvests or reinforces the direction you're already heading to, so that we can no longer claim that we are the ones doing the knowing. No, it's we, it's us, hyphenated with digital spaces, hyphenated with policies, hyphenated with the foods we're eating, hyphenated with microbial activisms, hyphenated with ancestral traumas, right? Knowing is the applause of multi-species projects. It's not reducible to us. And that's why we're in such a world we're in right now, I think. Politics, a lot of our politics is dependent on pedagogy. It's dependent on, if only we can speak truth to power, then we can rise up and push back against the lie. But in a situation where even the truth is unsure of itself, or our progress seems to echo what Martin Luther King was warning us about, that we're gradually moving into a burning house, even with our tending towards justice, then it seems that our game has to change. It cannot just merely be pedagogy alone, or teaching the other side the truth, or saying, do your research, because that's not where we're at any longer. As the Bible says, and I grew up in the church, there's a part in the Bible that says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in high places, right? Usually I would get an amen, but it's fine. Y'all are going to, you're not that crowd. But yes, Kurt, thank you for the gestural amen. We are, our work is not to convince the individual. Our work goes deeper than convincing the person of the error of their ways, which seems to be the entire managerial logistics of popular politics. That, oh, look at the facts. If only you look at the facts, then you'll be convinced otherwise. But even as a clinical psychologist, I know that this isn't in fact true. That I could show you why, hypothetically, you're in an addictive relationship with a substance. I can give you all the facts why you shouldn't return to an abuser. I can give you all these facts, and you would acknowledge the facts and say, yes, I accept that is true, and still be in that relationship, and still be in a substantial dependent relationship, right? It's that information itself cannot be reduced to data. Information is information, as Erin Manning would say. It's all the ways our bodies are informed or form in their milieus. It's all the ways we are being challenged, modified, engineered, right? Shaped, rooted, spirited away. It's the weather pattern around bodies and embodiment. It's not reducible to what we know. It's how we are known into being. And that's what I wanted to stay with. And why I recently coined a word called paragogy, which is not about how people know, it's how learning unlearns itself. Paragogy is my word for how learning unlearns itself, how systems come to the edges of their unknowability, right? How systems realize and change and often offer, you know, or prefer to the activist their own forms of resistance. Basically, how capitalism teaches the activist how to be anti-capitalist so that the anti-capitalist can sustain the logics of capitalism, right? It's all the ways that systems are learning ecologies themselves. We're taking the burden off the learning human, the one who has to learn all those things and cram all this information in its head, right? We're taking all of that away and we're suggesting that we pay attention to the weather patterns, that this political moment we're in calls for a different kind of political project that is not about convincing the other side that you're wrong or belittling them or demonizing them or saying you all are stupid or pathologically insane, right? It's about a different kind of gesture. And I think I say this from the urgency of my flesh, because these past few months I've been traveling like an exercised demon, and I've been in places where the vicissitudes of a proto-fascism are are thickening and heating up. I was just in Brazil. And I was there to meet with their president. I was given an invitation to have a private meeting with President Lula. I said this to Sarah recently. It didn't happen. I mean, it was going to happen, but he postponed it because Bolsonaro, previous guy in Brazil, was being sentenced to jail. That would have been fine. We would have had the meeting anyway. But about 50,000 or more to 100,000 Brazilians in São Paulo and every other part of Brazil hit the streets and carried American flags, appealing to Trump to come in and save the day. Basically, carried giant American flags, right? Calling on right-wing governments everywhere to save Bolsonaro. Recently, almost 1 million people I hear were led by Tony, is it Tommy Morrison? Does anyone know his name in the UK? Um, they hit the streets and were basically chanting for people with skin like mine to go back to where they come from. Go back to where you come from. This is not an American phenomenon. It seems that democracy itself is shriveling up. It's becoming pixelated. And we are in such times, terrifying times, where we need to learn afresh, where we need new kinds of gestures, not the spectacular kinds, not the blueprint kinds, not the kind that only depends on calling your senator. Other kinds of fugitive needs and gestures are needed right now. I would end with speaking to this concept by Earl Lovelace. He's a Trinidadian author. I think he's in his 90s or 80s now. He wrote about a concept called Bacano aesthetics. Earl Lovelace, Bacano aesthetics. Of course, Bacano from the name Bacchus, the god of wine and merrymaking. And he applied this concept of Bacano aesthetics to slave technologies. Basically, he was saying, in times like this, in Baldwinian fires, when things are getting hard, when fascism is on the rise, authoritarianism is on the rise, when everything you can do to push back against the hordes of lies, invading your lives, isn't working any longer, you need to go under. You need a different kind of sidestepping crustacean cartography. You need to step to the side like a crab, and you need to think differently. Now, this may not look like a solution, but it is. The new worlds are contingent upon these kinds of postures. And this is why I speak about Bacano aesthetics. This is why I'm premising the idea of paragogy on the poverty of pedagogy at this moment. It's not an either or situation for me. I'm not saying let's get rid of pedagogy. Of course, we need instruction. Of course, we need some kinds of expertise. But I think we're in such a moment where larger weather patterns have trumped the micro weather of pedagogy. And we will need to move differently to adjust to the larger storms that have that have deterritorialized the weather of the individual and have enlisted it into something stranger, right? Something that isn't something that is largely impervious to the things we used to call facts and instruction. Something that needs a different kind of gesture. Something that needs a cup of tea or a meal or a song or some ritual or ceremony, right? Something that needs for us to move to the sides awkwardly instead of marching forward as we have been doing. I think I'll stop there. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Bayo. My goodness, you know, what we're called into is so much outside of what we've ever imagined. And you're calling us into that space of not knowing, of I like the question of what the rituals might be for how we move sideways and through the cracks and into the dark.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And you see this moving sideways, it lends itself to a mode of inquiry or grammatical construction that I might call the subjunctive, right? Which is different from the indicative, right? The indicative people like. The indicative is declarative. It is we shall overcome. It is we will win the White House in 2028. It's guarantees that our righteousness has purchase power, that we're the good guys, that if only we invest this amount of money, it will bring about this amount of good. So people want a politics of the indicative, but the subjunctive is different. It is it's oceanic. It doesn't give guarantees. It says what if or maybe or perhaps, right? It's a different kind of politics altogether, right? And people don't really like that one, right? Like we want to storm, the Bastille and take the throne, but something else is needed now when even storming through can reinstall Napoleon as the emperor, right? The indicative does that all the time. It hides the real logics that are operational. Yes.
Yeah, we aren't in control, basically.
No, we're not in control. We're
And
not.
no one's comfortable when they're not in control. It's a new opportunity and a gift in its own way.
Yes.